Yeah, so let's go ahead and get started. I have a lot of things to talk about today, wrapped around macro wildlife photography. For a lot of people, that is an interesting handful of words. Most people, when you think of wildlife photographers, myself included for a long time, you think about the big telephoto lenses and photographing big, predators and cats and bears and birds and all sorts of fun stuff. And I think sometimes we miss the little things, kind of pun intended. As David was talking about, macro wildlife photography has been a new passion of mine for the last probably 4 years now. But it's something that definitely I didn't expect to be as interesting and exciting and to be as challenging as it ultimately ended up being initially once I began to open my eyes and change my mindset, which we'll talk about during this presentation. So let's talk about a few just real quick house cleaning things. Instagram, even though it's a little bit of a dying platform these days, some of you guys might not enjoy Instagram as much. Colby Brown Photography is where you can find me. It's a great place to reach out if you have questions after this talk or want to talk about other things or whatnot. It's a great place to connect. Of course, I have my website, colbybrownphotography.com. We have a lot of workshops all over the world where we teach things like what I'm going to talk about today with macro wildlife photography, as well as tons of other stuff in the wildlife, travel, astrocultural space as well. Lots of great information there, especially if you're Sony shooters. I have most gear setup guides for free to set up the new A1. Soon it'll be A7R5, all sorts of fun stuff, or those thinking about migrating, or just general information and knowledge is out there as well. And then as David had mentioned, this summer, the latest B&H project that I worked on with them was actually down in Ecuador and the Amazon. And what we did is we put together a 7-part video series that focused on wildlife, regular wildlife, macro, as well as some landscape, and then we did some editing and post-processing. So it's a 7-part free series on YouTube. You guys can check it out. It's fun. Most episodes are, 15 minutes long, but it's really well put together. B&H's production team did a phenomenal job. We had a lot of fun doing it. You can find it right now on B&H's YouTube page. All episodes have been released as of a few weeks ago, so it's worth checking out. We'll cover some of the same things in this talk about especially the macro episode that we did there, but we expand upon it quite a bit more because we have an hour rather than 15 minutes on YouTube. So let's talk a little bit about the journey into macro photography. So for me, I started doing photography full-time 18 years ago. Originally started out buying a camera right when digital SLRs were first getting more affordable and more accessible. And I purely jumped in because I had a love of travel. I wanted to be traveling. I just graduated from college. I wanted to explore more of the world, to step outside my comfort zone. And at the time, I didn't have a family. I was single. I was nomadic. I didn't have a ton of debt. So I just sold everything that I had after I graduated and started traveling around the world. And picking up a camera was purely by, not coincidence, it was intentional, but it was more happenstance where I just figured that if I had a camera, maybe I could take some photos, I could write a story or two, and it might allow me to live the backpacker life and travel around cheaply around, at the time I was going to Southeast Asia, for a few years and just make a little extra money on the side. And what I realized is that travel photography was that origin or inception point. It's always to me been about capturing experiences out there. But it was that genre of travel photography that's somewhat all-encompassing that pulled me in, that I found myself quickly kind of gravitating towards different types of genres. And the reason for that is that my personality doesn't do great when there's too much consistency, especially in the creative space. So if I do the same thing over and over and over again, I get bored real quickly. And so I constantly found myself throughout my career not reinventing myself, but challenging myself by dabbling in different types of fields within the genres of photography. And so it went from travel to landscape. I started a philanthropic, humanitarian-focused photography company called The Giving Lens, which is still in existence. Great stuff you can find on the internet about that. I started getting into culture. Eventually found myself interested in wildlife photography, which initially was more based on opportunity. I'd find myself going to beautiful locations around the world to work on projects that I was there to photograph, maybe Milky Ways over the Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia, but then there happened to be amazing flamingos that I wanted to learn how to capture. And so initially my jump into wildlife photography was just that. It was based on opportunity. And leading up into the COVID pandemic, I was kind of burned out, to be honest. I've been traveling at the time for almost, was it 16, 15 years at the time, constantly, all 7 continents, almost every single year. And I found myself needing a break and needing a creative sabbatical, so to speak. And once I got done of the same 12 to 14-month break of life that most of us had during that time space, I found myself re-energized and wanting to get back into a lot of different things. But it was during that COVID break that I really started diving much more into macro photography for the same reason David had mentioned. We weren't traveling, which was what I had been doing forever, for 18 years. COVID was interesting because I spent more time at home with my wife and son since my son was born and since me and my wife were married 13 years ago. And so having something like a macro lens or learning about macro lens and learning about flash photography, which at the time was very foreign to me, it was a really fun experiment that I really began to love and find passion in a place that I didn't think, like I mentioned before, was actually there. And so that's kind of like the whole idea of like why macro photography. It's new, it's different, it's challenging. As I mentioned, I got into wildlife photography with this idea of first opportunity, but then it became passion. Like, where can I travel to some exotic locations and photograph some amazing creatures that are out there? Tigers in India, you can get foxes in Patagonia, toucans in Costa Rica. And through that same process of needing to constantly challenge myself, try to do new and different things, but also based on that idea of opportunity within the wildlife space, I found myself in places like Costa Rica and being like, oh, hey, I'm here photographing all these amazing species, but like, what's that frog? And that snake looks interesting. Like all these things that I didn't think I might have been interested in, all of a sudden I found myself based on that opportunity. And as soon as you started to dip your toe into that water, I found myself just captivated by a world that I had overlooked for so long. And I think within the wildlife space especially, it is unique and different than most other species to photograph because it is much more accessible. Again, if you think about, maybe foxes are prominent in a lot of places in North America, but we don't have a ton of tigers. And unless you're flying all the way out to India or Sri Lanka and you're spending a lot of money, like there's a lot of barriers to entry to do that. And the same thing with the gear, right? I mean, I use a 400 millimeter f2.8 and a 600 millimeter f4, two $13,000 lenses a piece on most of my big wildlife trips around the world. That is not attainable for a lot of people, not only price-wise, but also distance-wise and all sorts of other elements. But when it comes to macro photography, we all have opportunities to do this in our own backyard. I live in eastern PA now, in the woods out there, about an hour and a half outside of New York City. And there are a ton of opportunities for stuff out of frogs and toads, different types of salamander, all sorts of fun stuff that, again, I just overlooked, stepped over, didn't pay attention to, that all of a sudden, once I got into macro wildlife photography and learned more about flash, which we're going to talk about, just opened up a whole new creative door that now I find myself planning trips all over the world to find very specific species of snakes or very unique forms of poison dart frogs in Central and South America. I just got done, and I'll show you guys some images from Uganda, going and looking for some of the most venomous snakes in East Africa, and just having a blast being out there photographing these amazing creatures that are sometimes vilified, sometimes not appreciated, just in the same vein as like people that do underwater photography think about sharks with the general public. I feel the same way about snakes. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and there's amazing creatures if you learn how to do it safely. And of course, you learn the different techniques in order to come away with some amazing images and experiences, which we're all hoping to do. So let's first start off talk about gear, because again, gear is important here. Not as significant as general wildlife photography, but it does play a role. So for me, I'm a Sony Artisan, as I mentioned before. So I've been with Sony for 7 years. I worked with Canon for a bit before that. I've done projects with Phase 1, shot Nikon for a little bit, but for the last 7 years, I've been a Sony Artisan. And so these days, I predominantly shoot with two A1s for everything. The A1, in my personal opinion, biased or not, is the most significant camera that we've had released in a long time. The fact that you can get 30 frames per second with a 50 megapixel camera, 30 frames per second, not a big deal for macro, but 50 megapixels is great for cropping in. You have 15 stops of dynamic range at ISO 100, which is still more than most of the competition out there. You get backside illuminated stacked sensors, super fast readout speeds, really great for autofocus, which still plays a role in a lot of macro work, especially with moving subjects, things like that. It is still my go-to camera. I can take this one camera with me when I'm going to photograph, cheetahs at full speed in Namibia, and then, head over to East Africa to photograph snakes, and then go to photograph birds in flight, and then go to photograph a beautiful sunset. It can kind of do a little bit of everything. For me, that is still, like I said, it's my go-to camera. I highly recommend to check it out if you guys haven't. At the booth over there, a lot of great technology that's inside it. The new A7R5 is something that I'm quite excited about. I haven't used extensively. I'm actually taking it with me. I leave tomorrow to head up to Alaska to go photograph bald eagles for the final migration up in Haines for the next week and a half. But it has a handful of different technology inside it that I think is quite interesting and is kind of a prelude or foreshadowing towards where the industry is going. What I mean by that is that it's not the 61 megapixel sensor, which is great. More resolution is great, except for hard drive space. But what it has is this new AI processing unit that I'm sure at least some of you guys have heard about. So it's the first camera in the entire world that has a dedicated processor inside the camera for AI learning. And this is tied towards autofocus. And what it can do is essentially recognize the specific species of animal that you're photographing. And it can predictively expect where it thinks it's going to go. It understands movements of different types of insects, which now has eye autofocus for, as well. It can sit there and look at certain types of birds and have a better idea of predictive flight patterns, like all sorts of different things. This is the first time in a camera you have a processing unit that is dedicated towards that. Because previously what happens is that you have a certain amount of processing power per camera. And anytime you want to add these new features, it's taking away processing power of potential other features. And so for the A7R5, it's really interesting to see this being the first camera come out with it. I'm super excited to try it out, mixed in with the fact that Sony finally has some image stacking capability, which some of the competition has had for a while, which is interesting from a macro perspective. But there's that AI predictive processor unit that I think is going to be interesting, especially as we see that start to trickle in for the Sony lineup into other Sony mainstay cameras, as well as I guarantee you're going to see something similar in some of the other competition that's out there that's just slightly behind in terms of that specific processing feature set. But that's really interesting to figure out and understand in an autofocus space exactly how can you step things up to the next level. Because if you really think about it, we're starting to reach the heights of what sensors can do with a standard full-frame sensor, with ISO and noise, even dynamic range. Unless you shoot medium format, you're not going beyond 15 stops of light. And even then, it's only at ISO 100. The future for a lot of what the professional cameras you guys are using out there is going to be in AI, and it's going to be in computational learning. A lot of the stuff that we've seen start off with, coincidentally, in the cell phone space, where Sony actually manufactures most of those sensors, including those in most of your iPhones out there. But a lot of that interesting technology is going to start trickling up into this camera, into the camera gear that we're all, excited to be using, and it's going to be really interesting. It's going to be kind of the new forefront of where things are going across the board, not just in the macro wildlife space. So moving on to lenses, the two most common lenses that I use in macro wildlife photography. Sony has the Sony 90mm f2.8 macro lens. It is one that's been around for a while. To be honest, I'm actually hopeful that they come out with a new version in the next year or two with the new linear motors that are in most of other Sony's lenses. But it's still a pillar lens when it comes to macro wildlife photography. It's super sharp. It's great bokeh. It's great to control. You have a lot of great features inside it. It's not overly heavy. 90 millimeters is a nice distance. You get a nice 1-to-1 ratio with this particular lens. Essentially means that when you work with the minimum focus distance, you're getting a 1-to-1 actual size preview of whatever photograph thing you're trying to photograph. Some other macro lenses are different ratios instead of 1-to-1, which means they will be enlarged a little bit larger than they actually are in real life. This one in particular is a 1-to-1, but it's still a great camera and or a great lens, and still something that I use in most of my macro work. And then when I find myself working, as you guys will see here, with specific species that are, how do you put it, overly aggressive and highly deadly, there are times when you don't want to be 6 inches away from a venomous snake that's extra bitey that morning. So in those situations, most of the time I use a 70-200, the new 70-200 f2.8 G Master lens. This is the new version that just came out. It's half the weight of the first generation. It's incredibly sharp. It's smaller, it's lighter, it's portable. It's an amazing lens. I kind of joke around that it's so sharp you can shave with it, but it's a great setup. It's a great lightweight option to be a little bit more of at a safe distance. But yeah, it's a great lens to use and a nice compression. I've also used the 100-400, which can work if you're on a tripod and you're further away to really get some nice compression with certain types of species, but more times than not, I use the 70-200 in that range. So let's talk a little bit about light. Now, most of you guys that have been here, I'm sure at some point have heard Scott Kelby talk. I'm sure most of you guys have. Anyone heard Kelby speak about flash before? So I've known Scott for a long time. Scott is a phenomenal educator in the flash space. I've spoken at a number of events, including Kelby's own events back in the day. And up until recently, I had the same response. Anyone talk to me about flash, which they sit there and say, what flash are you using? Or I have clients ask. And my response was the same as it is for anyone that doesn't fully understand flash, was that, no, I'm a natural light photographer. That's generally the response for someone that doesn't fully understand how to properly use flash. And that was absolutely me for a long time. I would sit there and I would think about flash, or I would think about flash not knowing necessarily where to start or how to properly use it, and think that anytime it was used, or that I potentially would use it, it would look fake. It would look unrealistic. It wouldn't give me the results that I wanted to. And it wasn't until I really started diving into understanding flash, off-camera flash, using multiple different flashes, which we'll talk about a little bit in a second, to really control lighting, especially with macro wildlife photography. It was kind of my inception point, dipping my toe into that flash world, realizing so many opportunities that I missed early on in my career because of some sense of ignorance, or at least I was apathetic towards that type of approach with this kind of photography. But flash is super important in the wildlife space. So I have 3 different images here I'm about to show you of a very particular snake that I was intentionally went out to go find in East Africa, actually just 2 months ago when I was in Uganda. And it's called a rhinoceros viper. It's a fascinating looking guy. It has these beautiful spikes on the front of it. You understand why it has this name, rhinoceros, right? Beautiful, beautiful creature. And the way that you can photograph, obviously, any of these subjects are generally broken down in the macro wildlife space into 3 different spaces, 3 different opportunities that you can find yourself in. Now, of course, you have natural light. Now, this is something that, as obvious as it sounds, you could only do when you have proper light. Now, in the macro space, you don't always have that opportunity, because sometimes you're working under dense jungle where there's not a ton of light. And sometimes you find yourself working at night in the middle of forest or your local pond or wherever it is, and obviously there is no light, so you have to use flash. So natural light is it's a very specific look. When you have light, I usually almost always try to get some natural light shots, but I can tell you I prefer the flash look. It's just my personal cup of tea, but it is an option out there in certain situations. Now, in addition to natural light, you also have fill light. So this is the idea of using your flash, still off-camera flash. This is most of the type of flash that I use. And you're essentially just using the light from your speed light, is usually what I use, to be able to fill and add a little bit of extra light, but still have it be a natural environment. These are great opportunities, again, when you have some light to work with. Not always the case, but when you do have it, it can be nice, where you can find unique opportunities to use a little bit of fill light. You still get the nice little catch light in the eyes, you can see there in this rhinoceros viper. But it still looks much more natural outside of that catch light. And then you can use flash even during the day to completely overpower all light. This, to me, is really interesting. It gives much more of a studio look, even though I was, sweating like crazy and, had bug bites and all sorts of fun stuff in the jungles in East Africa and Uganda. It looks like it's in a studio, but you're out there in the field. And specifically using your off-camera flash, I generally use 2 flashes. In this case, it was 1 high-powered flash with a stronger power rating, which we'll talk about in a second, in order to block out all of the other light that was out there in the field, giving me a very distinct and unique look to apply to the type of image that I was looking to create. So what are your flash options? So every different manufacturer, for the most part, carries their own flash systems, and those are great. Because I teach a lot of workshops, including stuff where I'm teaching macro wildlife photography, I generally use more of the third party because they're more universally accessible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about two different products here. One from Aperture, which is just kind of a general LED light, and then a Godox flash, which you actually have out here at the Godox place if you're looking for a new flash option. We'll talk about that in a second. But the first option, and not my favorite, but certainly an option out there, there are LED lights. Now this is an Aperture MC RGB LED light. The cool thing about this is that you can dial in the color spectrum for whatever you want. So it can be great to create some very unique and creative macro wildlife images if you want to adjust the background color or play around with tone and tint with different types of things. When I first started doing macro wildlife photography, I took a couple of these down to Costa Rica a few years back and used them purely as my light source. And the problem is that it just never outputs enough light. So I couldn't use a high enough aperture, which we're going to talk about in a second. The look and feel was okay, but I had to use slightly higher ISOs and shutter speeds that I wasn't comfortable with doing ultimately. I find it much better to use a proper speed light. Now, the reason that I like to use speed lights rather than constant lights is because A, I'm focusing on still photography, but B, they're generally just much more portable. So for the most part these days, I use a series of the Godox V863s. Now it's a 65 watt flash, which is important. It outputs enough power to get the types of images that I want to. In most situations, I use two of these together with the softbox, which I think I have a slide of here talking about the softboxes. And this gives me the freedom and flexibility for off-camera, purely wireless flash, which we'll talk about a wireless commander in a second, to really control and direct light. And this is the biggest thing when it comes to macro wildlife photography, is that your settings don't change a whole lot, which we'll talk about. Your composition and your lighting really make or break these images. And those happen in a handful of different ways, which again we'll discuss. But regardless, off-camera flash gives you that most flexibility. If you're working with small subjects, you can use a single flash unit. I personally prefer two, especially if I'm working with larger macro wildlife situations, such as some of the snakes, because then again you can control backlighting. You can truly become your own little director of photography. So the main different wireless commander that I personally use is the Godox X Pro S. That's a TTL wireless flash trigger. I usually use it on manual. TTL is just a way to communicate for the camera to tell how much flash power you want. It's the same principle that I like to think about when I'm mostly shooting wildlife photography. I shoot in manual mode because I like to control all the different elements of the exposure. TTL makes it easy for you if you want the camera to do it, but where's the fun in that? So I usually shoot in manual mode, controlling the power of each of my flash that either myself or I have other people helping hold, depending on the type of subject that I'm trying to photograph. But I can control all of the power output from this device that sits on the hot shoe of my camera, making it very easy. And then softboxes are super, super helpful. Softboxes really help diffuse that light. So if you don't have a softbox, you get really harsh shadows. It's hard light that's hitting your subject. If you're not familiar with flash, these are super handy because they essentially take the flash and the power of the flash and then spread out and soften the light to be much more visceral and appealing rather than that hard light. So you don't get the softer shadows, you get a much more appealing look. And so that's what I use for off-camera flash. If I'm working on a system or if I'm in a situation where I find myself out there alone, then oftentimes where I can't have other people helping hold, especially if I'm trying to use two flashes, because I only have two hands and not three to hold the camera, then I will use something like this. This is a custom-built diffuser that sits on camera flash. This is great for smaller stuff if you're photographing small insects in your backyard or small frogs or things like that. But it's really great because the light will hit the front diffuser, bounce off the bottom and the top, and it really does a good job of surrounding your image. You can't get truly creative with your shots, but you can get really nice, well-lit shots of some pretty amazing species that are out there. So most of the time, these are the situations that I find myself in. So this is the same rhinoceros viper that you guys saw before, sitting right there on the tree, just a couple inches away from myself. I'm almost always working with professionals out there in the field, which we'll have a whole section talking about using naturalist guides in certain situations. But using the flash, you can see right here, I'm holding one flash, setting things up. I have someone else holding the secondary flash depending on the type of backlight I was going for this particular image. But this is usually what's happening. I'm out there in the field, I'm looking for these amazing species, and then I'm figuring out how can I get creative with composition, subject placement, how I'm going to frame them, and then certainly how I can control the light, which, like I said, is quite big. So let's talk about camera settings. This is a cute little baby chameleon, and it usually gets everyone's attention to start with. But camera settings, when it comes to macro wildlife photography, doesn't vary a whole lot. It's not like regular wildlife photography where you have very different situations or settings for a bird perched, and then a bird in flight, and then a cheetah running at you, and all this other stuff. For the most part, most of my settings stay relatively the same. So I'm generally shooting with ISO 100 or 200. My aperture is going to range. That's going to be the one variable. It's going to range from anywhere between f11 to f22. Now, when you start shooting at higher apertures, you do end up dealing with issues of diffraction. Diffraction is essentially where you're shooting at a too high of aperture, which is expounded or exacerbated more accurately when you work in macro wildlife photography or macro use, where it softens your image a little bit. But the reality is that because you're using a macro lens with such a shallow depth of field, you really need to have a high aperture in order to get a wider plane of focus, more of your image in focus. So in this particular case, it's not just the chameleon's eye, it's the back of their head, it's halfway down the body, it's some of their arm, if not their full arm. And so I'm willing to sacrifice a little diffraction, a slight bit of softness that I'm going to correct in post-processing by shooting at f18, which I normally might not do in other situations. Whereas I could have a slightly sharper image at f11, but then I'd have more issues with depth of field. So in this case, that f8, f11 to f22 is generally my range. And then I usually stick right around 1/200th of a second. For those that don't know, that don't use flash, with 99% of the cameras that are out there, 1/200th of a second is your minimum or your maximum speed for sync speed with flash. With the Sony A1, it's the only camera that can actually do 1/400th of a second, but you don't need to do that because these subjects aren't moving very fast at all, and you don't need to worry about all sorts of other issues that you normally would use that if you had a lot of light and you're trying to use very shallow apertures during daylight for portraits and other things in different genres. So it's a poison dart frog in Costa Rica. This one, as I mentioned, was when I was using those LED lights. So you can see I had to put my ISO up to 1,000. I shot at f14, and it was at 1/30th of a second, which is really way, way too slow. I had to take so many different shots in this particular image to get this frog, not only because this was a male that was trying to attract a female, so it was kind of puffing itself up. So it was moving slightly, but it took a handful of shots to get that tack sharp result, rather than if I use a speed light, threw the flash on it, and could stick with general, more of a standard shutter speed and still have everything in focus, and shoot at a much lower ISO for a cleaner image. And then this is the situation. This is an eyelash pit viper, a beautiful, beautiful species, again, found in Central and South America. And it's called an eyelash pit viper because it has little eyelashes above its eyes. And this is one that I shot on a tripod with a 100 to 400 at a distance. So you get that really nice compression. This was more natural light. But you could see even then, I still had to shoot at ISO 1000, 1/60th of a second because it was really late in the day. It was something that I probably, in retrospect, would have preferred to have a flash and go with a different type of look, even though the natural light look in this situation, I feel, does look quite nice. So getting creative with lighting, this is where things, like I mentioned, you have the most flexibility, and I think where most people get the most confused as well. The difference between macro wildlife photography and portrait studio work is really not that different. It's about the power of light and the direction of light. And what you can do when you learn what you're capable of doing or how flashes work really can open up some incredible opportunities to capture species in ways that either haven't been done before or at least very rarely have been done. This is a palm leaf pit viper, again in Costa Rica. and using just a single flash shooting from underneath the palm leaf, which that's how they get their name, that's typically where they're found, being able to light it up front side with a high enough power, but instead of going for 2 flashes and lighting up the underside, you're letting contrast play its role. It's a unique composition, it's uniquely lit, it pulls all the pieces together. And I've yet to see another image of these types of snakes shot in this way, even though it's the most common place where you can find them. Maybe too many people don't want to be sitting underneath a palm leaf with a poisonous, venomous pit viper sitting on top, but if you're willing to do so, and you can do it safely, you can get some great results. Same thing can be said for poison dart frogs, being able to find unique compositions within them, lighting things up, using that light to control the effect, the feel, the atmosphere, the mood of the image. And what's really interesting is that it also allows you to control the overall, the feeling, I guess I would say, of how everything kind of comes together. The colors that are presented when you use flash properly. You don't overexpose or blow out your shot with too much light based on your settings that you're using. Can really be incredible, pulling out iridescent colors that you might not have seen otherwise, or highlighting colors and features that you, again, wouldn't be able to see if you shot with natural light itself. And then you can have a lot of fun playing around different species. Every different species has different personalities. Every different creature has its own personality as well. So sometimes when I'm photographing something, I usually try to limit my time with them just to make sure that I'm not infringing too much on their own personal space, which we'll talk a little bit during the ethics part of this conversation. But you can have a lot of fun once you get to know if someone's a little bit more curious. You can find them in different places and kind of follow along with them and try to get shots like this, where again, I'm purposely using just a single flash unit in order to let contrast and the use of negative space really speak for itself, allowing the subject to take center frame, even if it's something that's quite small and unique in this particular shot. So flash can freeze action. I think a lot of people that understand flash know this. You don't need to shoot at high shutter speeds in order to get something frozen in time, because what happens is when the flash unit hits your subject, you have just that window where your camera is working with your flash unit can capture and freeze that moment in time. For me, this is most prevalent in macro photography with snakes. So with snakes, being able to use still a shutter speed that isn't overly high. I think this one was still 1/200th of a second. But as the snake was using its tongue, which they commonly do, in order to sense what's happening around you, they sense heat that way. They understand their prey and predators, what's happening with them, is that you can kind of get and freeze the motion of that shot. It's truly an amazing opportunity to get these unique images like this, using flash to kind of freeze motion. This one is one of my favorites. These are one of my favorite kinds of snakes. Coincidentally, are not venomous, even though most of my other ones are. This is a vine snake, a green vine snake. They're pretty common in Central and South America. But what's interesting is that they're not venomous. They don't have venom glands. They have sharp little teeth, so if they bite, it's not going to be your favorite moment, but it's not going to be a trip to the hospital, or worse. But they're very aggressive. And so you have to make sure when you come across them, A, that you're being safe, but also you have to find yourself in a situation where you might have a little bit more control. In this particular situation, what happened is we came across this green vine snake, and it was kind of wrapping itself and coiling itself around a tree where we found it, or this log you can kind of see down there. And as it was, it started kind of aggressively going towards the camera, and just what we did, as I was working with some snake wranglers and some naturalist guides, is that as it was kind of inching towards me, is that they just lightly used their finger and just kind of put their hand on the back tail, just lightly. So the snake couldn't move for a few seconds, so I was able to get the shot safely. But that's how most of these types of shots happen, is that you're sitting there and you're doing a light controlling of the situation. As soon as you're done, and it was about a minute getting the shots that we wanted to, we let it go back right where it came from. But that's how when you see shots like this, that's usually the situation. You're not, the photographer's not out there dancing around and jumping out of snake bites to get the shot. It's usually a little bit more of a controlled situation. But sometimes you can find unique spots where you do work with venomous snakes that can be a little bit more aggressive, even if they're not necessarily super big threats towards human beings. In this particular case, this was a Great Lakes viper again. I love vipers. And this particular one took an issue not with myself, not with our guides or naturalists that was out there, with actually the softbox. The softbox, it was not a huge fan of. And so anytime we brought the softbox a little closer to kind of light up what I was going for, you would see its mouth start to open. So it really created for these great opportunities to photograph this particular snake. And what's interesting about them, about most snakes, is that their jaws are not, they're not connected and attached on both sides. So what happens is the gland comes out on one, you can see the fang come out on one, and then so I have a couple shots of just like one fang up, and then you see the other one kind of come up once it gets into bite mode. But this was shot on a macro lens as well, but because it was looking at the softbox and not myself who was on the side, then there was no real danger of what was happening. But like I said, it just allows you to freeze those moments right before stuff happens, which is pretty amazing. So find reflective surfaces. This is something I always recommend doing. I'll give you two examples here. The first one is where you're creating your own reflective example. What I mean by that is that oftentimes, especially when I'm working with frogs and amphibians, is that when we go into the jungle to find these creatures out there in the wild, we will often bring sometimes a 12-inch by 12-inch, sometimes a little bit bigger glass plate. And then we set up like an art stand and hold it on both sides. And then when we find the species we would like to photograph, again, we're working with naturalist guides that are trained to be able to handle and hold these creatures. We'd be able to put it on the glass plate that's close to the ground. So again, they're not at risk of getting hurt or anything. And then you can use your flash to create some really unique shots. And that's how you're getting kind of these reflective shots. This particular approach is done oftentimes with frogs, especially glass frogs, which can have translucent skin, essentially using flash from underneath to light the frog itself, and you also photograph from underneath the glass plate to see through it. And then what happens is that certain species of them actually have translucent skin, so you can see all their insides. It's a very unique shot. I don't have anyone for this presentation, but that's what gave me the idea to start creating stuff like this with certain types of glass frogs and poison dart frogs. And of course, water can be a great source as well. This was actually a macro lens with a baby caiman taken in Central America and Panama, where it was holding very crazily still. I figured as I got close to it, it was going to take off, but it just held there. We used a flash to take a couple quick shots, and then it eventually found its way, out of the scene. But great reflection opportunities for a scene like this. Perspective matters. This is something that I think is important in all genres of photography, especially in the macro world, because obviously we are much taller and bigger than the creatures that we're out there photographing. So being able to photograph many of these species as you can at eye level is really big. And what it does is it allows you to make much more connections with the species, I think creating much more interesting images. This is a Gabon viper, also found in East Africa. It's a very large snake. They can weigh upwards of like 10 pounds. They're quite large. Coincidentally, they're incredibly venomous, but they very rarely bite human beings. They're not very aggressive, so they're really easy to photograph. I was really lucky to find them on this last trip to Uganda. But the most interesting composition that I found was kind of that straight-on shot. And so doing it safely again, because you don't want to put yourself in peril, using the new mirrorless cameras, having that flip-out articulating screen on the back, literally put it on the ground, articulated the screen out, and then I felt comfortable enough to just use my finger to take the shots, but I could, of course, jumped into my cell phone wirelessly and been able to take the shots from there. But having that perspective of being right there at eye level, right at its face, to me made the most unique type of image possible with this particular snake. And the same thing can be said about frogs again. I think you have to be willing, if you're interested in macro wildlife photography, to get a little bit dirty, lay on the ground when you need to, bring a little camping chair if you need, like whatever it is that allows you to kind of get down and be able to photograph these species at their space, I think is awesome. Because like I said, it just gives you much higher potential to kind of pull everything together and have a little bit more of a unique image where the eyes can play more of a role into the shots that you're doing, which I think most wildlife photographers try to do anyway. So let's talk about 5 quick tips for macro wildlife photographers that are out there. So tip number one, this is the same one for those that listen to my talk earlier today. This is more about general wildlife. And that's the idea of customizing your camera. So the last thing you want to do is be in the middle of the jungle in a place that you don't know, in the middle of the night, trying to worry about something not biting you, and you're fumbling with your camera to kind of pull things together. How do you adjust your flash speeds? How do you adjust your ISO on the fly? How do you change your autofocus zone? Every time I get a new camera, I dial in every different button, every different setting to fit the needs I have as a photographer. I try to sit there and proactively think about the stuff that I photograph. What features, functionality, or settings do I need to be one click away or less? If I can't access it while I'm looking through the viewfinder, then I want to make sure that that's not a priority for me to have access to. So if you're moving to a new system, like someone coming into the Sony space from Canon or Nikon or Fuji or Olympus or whatnot, and people say, oh, the menus are different. Yes, they are. But if you take time to dial in your camera, I don't ever need to go into the menus because I have everything dialed in exactly as I need. It just takes time to do so. But having this stuff dialed in beforehand makes it so much easier to be out there in the field, especially in a new environment, so that you make sure, like I said, you have all of these features and functionality as close to you as possible. So be silent when possible. This is, again, super important. I talked about this a little bit in my talk earlier today, that idea that mirrorless cameras can now be truly silent. This started off with the A9, first A9, A9 II, A1, all the Sony cameras now. I think your mirrorless cameras in Canon and Nikon also now have the features, which are great. But when you're out on safari and you're photographing lion cubs, once I've gotten used to silent mode, I feel the digital SLRs are exponentially louder than I remember them when I shot them. But it doesn't matter all that much to most creatures out there because they've gotten somewhat used to that. It's a little bit different in the macro world. A, they're not used to it. Most species you come across might not have had tons of other human contact. But sitting with a camera super close to them and having your shutter go off, make super loud noise, can scare a lot of these creatures away. So shooting in silent mode makes a big difference. This is, again, why I shoot with the A1 or now the A7R5 with its focus stacking features. But either way, having something shoot in truly silent mode really can make a big difference and allows you to get much closer than you might have otherwise. And like I said, it helps with all different types of species that are out there, from katydids to poison dart frogs, all sorts of fun stuff. These creatures, the poison dart frogs, this thing looks huge because I shot it with a macro lens and there's a very small crop in there. But these things are this big, like they're super tiny. So you want to minimize the amount of times that, A, you're stressing them out just from an ethical standpoint, but also so you can get the photographs that you're looking for as well. You want to minimize that amount of extra noise that you're bringing to it. So working with local guides, again, this is super, super important. You obviously probably don't need to hire a local guide to go check out your local park or hang out in your backyard if you're trying this. But when you start traveling around to find some very unique, rare, and certainly some venomous species, you definitely want to make sure that you're working with some of the best people that are out there. I usually go with starting off with word of mouth, like who do I know that's been to a location that can find someone that I trust or can verify. If I can't find that, I'm usually going to places like TripAdvisor or specifically to macro wildlife photography. There's the study or the pursuit of understanding for amphibians and frogs and reptiles, things like that. It's called herpology or herping. So there's lots of message forums about that where you can go and find local guides in different locations. Having people that you know that work with some of these best people that know what they're doing with a specific species so that you stay safe, the animal stays safe, everyone stays in good regards, and you can still also come away with the images you want is incredible. And this is more important than ever, of course, especially with snakes. This is, again, the same rhinoceros pit viper. If you're walking around in the jungles out there, most people are not going to be paying attention exactly everywhere you're stepping. This is how easily they camouflage. The Great Lakes pit viper sitting on the green moss. You're not going to be able to see them and find them. I can tell you that from personal experience. But also, just from a safety standpoint, you always want to make sure that you're working with people that know what they're doing. So the environment can play a role. This is where it's a little bit less of a studio shoot, where you really want to bring in a little bit more of the environment into the shot to get a sense and feel for where they're at. What is their environment? How does that play a role into the images you're trying to create? This is a bullet ant. For those that don't know, this is probably the most painful bite in all of the insect world. It's not something I highly recommend for anyone to ever experience. But they're amazing to photograph, super unique, and again, something that most people kind of disregard. But being able to pull in a bit more of the leaf, making sure I intentionally lit up some more of the stuff that was behind it to give it more sense of environment, really, to me, helped make something that was more unique, seeing that leaf in the back bottom part of the frame, rather than just focusing on the ant itself. This is a hognose viper as well, just lighting up kind of the areas that it's most known to be in terms of the leaflets. Making sure that you understand that's part of it. You can see how they kind of blend into the background and what's happening. I didn't light up the rest of the background, but I still wanted to give a little bit of that environment or a feel for the shot. And then the same thing, this is a coordinated boa constrictor. And being able to use this more as a fill flash in this particular case gave me that opportunity to show exactly where we were at. We were out there in the jungle using the flash to be able to balance the type of shots that I was going for, creating something that was more unique rather than just the studio look, which plays a role. And then coming back to that same palm leaf pit viper, we had a rainstorm, so it was raining on the snake when it was on top of this palm leaf. And so then being able to find that unique composition, water dripping off of its face, using that light to get something unique. And then with 50 megapixels, it's great because I can actually crop in on this like straight to its face, and it's just this really unique shot that you get detailed. The details are amazing. But it's that idea of bringing in that environment, I think, can play a role rather than just the studio setup or feel that you get when you overpower all light that's out there. So maintaining ethical boundaries, this is, again, a big part of working with these small creatures. I think anytime you find yourself in a space where obviously the creatures that you're trying to photograph are in threat of getting hurt, that means that you're doing something wrong. You should never affect them in a negative way. You should minimize the amount of time that you're spending with a lot of these creatures because they can get stressed out just from too much human interaction. You shouldn't handle any of the species unless you truly know what you're doing, because I think it can play a really big role into accidentally how some of that stuff can generally happen. This is why I always work with professional guides and locals in all the different places I work in around the world. But you want to make sure that you know people that are, like I said, are going to find them, know how to find them, know where they're at, and then know how to handle them, know their characteristics, can teach you all about them, because there's so much stuff out there that a lot of people don't know. And ultimately, the idea is to come away with these kind of unique and engaging images that are different, that, you know, you wouldn't have had the opportunity otherwise if you didn't work with local guides, if you didn't use a flash, if you didn't find yourself out, like I said, at night in the middle of some of these locations, or even, like I said, in your own backyard. Since I've gotten into macro wildlife photography outside of the exotic trips I do around the world, now focusing on random, crazy species of snake and frogs and insects, when I'm at home, it's fun to sit there. My son comes running in and says, hey, we found a new toad, sitting in our backyard. I can run out and grab my flash and show him how to do it, have some fun with it. But it's really great because, like I said, it's so accessible. There's a lot of great opportunities to learn about how you can appreciate species, like I mentioned, that are often more vilified, the snakes especially. I can't tell you how many times on my macro wildlife trips, like I do in Costa Rica coming up in January, where I have people that say, oh, I'm interested in kind of what you're talking about. I'm interested in learning about flash or taking pictures of frogs, but snakes freak me out. Or maybe it's spiders or whatnot. And if you think about it, so much of our misconceptions have stemmed from cultural aspects of, Disney picking the winners and losers in the wildlife space. It's always snakes that are evil. It's always the sharks. It's always hyenas. They always pick these winners and losers, and oftentimes just through constant bombardment, we begin to think that these creatures are innately bad or good, and that's just not the case. They're just beautiful creatures. And so I hope you guys have a little bit better understanding of what it takes within the macro space, have an understanding and appreciation of the creatures that are out there. And I hope it's piqued a little bit of your curiosity, because especially for those that are interested in wildlife, there's just so many doors that this opens up, both, like I said, in your own backyard or certainly around the world. So with that said, that's my talk for today.